Bruce Lorenz, and this show's called Bruce on the Loose. We talk to people from the school system and city government, and also the county officials as well. We're back for the second show with Carl Catraro, and he is an expert on the Cleveland Indians history. And Carl, looking forward to show number 2. And we're starting in the early 1900s where we left off show number 1. And how did the Indians get its name?
Well, this is kind of picking up where we left off last time, is that at the end of the 1914 season, the Cleveland team was called the Cleveland Naps after Napoleon Lajoie. But after the 1914 season, Napoleon Lajoie was getting a bit old. Cleveland had decided it was time to move on from him to a different player, and so he was sent back to Philadelphia Athletics, and so now the Cleveland Naps were effectively napless. So they now had to get a new name. So the owner of the team worked with the 3 different Cleveland newspapers to have the fans come in and give suggestions for a new team name. Well, the sports writers from those different papers got the suggestions and basically said, you know what, let's forget those and let's go with a different name. So they went with the name Indians, and this was a nickname that was applied to the Cleveland Spiders back from the 1897 season because of a player that the Cleveland Spiders had, and that would be Louis Sockalexis. Louis Sockalexis was a full-blooded American Indian, a Native American who played on the Cleveland Spiders, and at that time the team was nicknamed the Chief, Louis Sockalexis, and his Indians. And so they just basically picked up that name from 15 years prior, and they decided that's what would be the best name for the team. So it wasn't a lot of thought put into it necessarily, but that's what they came up with, is why they went with that.
Who was the owner of the team at this time?
This was Charles Summers, and Charles Summers, he had a bit of financial problems because back then the team was starting to lose, and because they were losing, the fans weren't coming, they were losing money, and so Charles Summers decided he had to also do something else, and that's to start to sell off players. And so one of the players he sold off was a player who would be known very well later, and that would be Shoeless Joe Jackson. He was a Cleveland, actually Naps product, but Shoeless Joe Jackson was he was signed by the Cleveland Naps in the 1911 season, and he played with them until the mid-1915 season, at which time he was sold off to the White Sox, where he's of course known today for the Black Sox scandal. But he was sold for a pretty large sum back then of $31,500. Doesn't sound like much today, but back then that was the most ever paid for a player, and that helped Charles Summers pay his bills for a while, but not too long.
Yeah, Shoeless Joe was just very, very proficient Southern player, and he really kind of hit it off with Ty Cobb. And in 1912, he hit .409. He was unbelievable.
Phenomenal hitter, and if it weren't for his mix-up with the Black Sox scandal, he definitely would have been in the Hall of Fame.
Who were some of the best players of the Indians during this era?
Well, the other player that came very shortly after this was when the Indians were sold. Summers sold the team to a guy named James Dunn, and he put some money into the team, and he acquired a player who would be very instrumental, and that would be Tris Speaker. Tris Speaker was one of the elite players of the American League at that time. He came over from the Boston Red Sox, and so he would later become the manager of the Indians. He was their center fielder, manager, leader, phenomenal player, great hitter, great defensive guy, all around a very, very good player. So he was definitely one of the players of that time. Also, too, at this time they were acquiring some good players, and so they also acquired Jim Bagby. Jim Bagby was a pitcher during this era. He had a 31-win season in 1920. So there were also some other great pitchers at this time. Stan Kovaleski, whose picture I don't have, but he was also one of the pitchers of this time. Steve O'Neill was on the team. He was the catcher. He also was a very good hitter too. He would become a future manager of the team later in the 30s. Steve O'Neill, a very popular player. And the other player who was very popular during this era was Ray Chapman. Ray Chapman was the team shortstop, very popular player, great hitter, great defensive guy, and so all around a very good player for the Cleveland Indians.
Ray Chapman, however, unfortunately passed away. Can you tell us about that?
Ray Chapman is still today and hopefully forever the only fatality ever suffered on the field of play as a result of playing baseball. On August 16th, 1920, they were facing the New York Yankees. Ray Chapman was at bat, and he was crowding the plate a bit, and Carl Mays, the pitcher for the Yankees, he was kind of a submarine pitcher, and at this time, the balls that they used they were all scuffed up, and they had tobacco juice on them and all these type of things, so the ball was darting all over the place, and so when Carl Mays threw the pitch, it darted in, it hit Ray Chapman on the head with such force that it sounded like it actually hit the bat, and Carl Mays threw him out thinking it hit the bat. Well, here he was struck in the head with such force that he died the next day on August 17th, 1920.
So, very different from today. The pitchers I see, even after a fly ball, they look at the ball, throw it out,
yes,
and they just go through probably dozen after dozen of baseballs, unlike in the past.
Well, in the past, the fans would have to throw the ball back in. They didn't even get to keep the ball.
Right.
So it's a totally different era as far as that goes, too.
So kind of interesting, Ray Chapman passes away in 1920, and yet they get to the World Series. Who did they play during that series?
In 1920 World Series, the Indians played the Brooklyn Dodgers. Sometimes they were called the Brooklyn Robins because of their owner or their manager, Wilbert Robinson. And this was an interesting also period because this was an era where they had a 9-game World Series instead of the 7-game World Series. And so the Cleveland Indians recovered from this terrible mishap with Ray Chapman. Joe Sewell took his place, and so they were able to outlast the Chicago White Sox and also the New York Yankees to win the 1920 pennant and face the Brooklyn Dodgers in the 1920 World Series, in which they won 5-2.
How did the Indians fare during the decade of the 1930s?
Well, the 1930s were an era for the Indians where they were always a good, solid team. They had 9 winning seasons, 1 losing season, and that 1 losing season they only lost by 1 game. So they could have had 10 winning seasons during the 1930s. However, they never finished higher than 3rd. They never finished closer than 12 games back, and that's because they were good, but they weren't great. Because this was the era of the Yankees were always going to be good. You had one year the Tigers were very good, the Senators were good, the Philadelphia Athletics were good. So the Indians were good, they were just never good enough in the 1930s.
During the decade of the 1930s, was Municipal Stadium under construction?
The Cleveland Municipal Stadium was started in 1930, and there's a myth that always seems to be even around today that it was built to try to attract the 1932 Olympics. But that wasn't the case. It was really just it was constructed because Cleveland was the 6th largest city in the United States at the time, and the city officials wanted to help the city continue to grow, and they felt they needed this large stadium to attract large venues, large sporting events, and they did such a thing. So they built it in 1930, 1931. The stadium was constructed, and although interestingly enough, they did not secure a lease agreement with the Cleveland Indians, and so they built this thing without making sure that the Cleveland Indians were going to play their baseball games there. And so they didn't. The Cleveland Indians played a lot of their baseball games during the 1930s back at good old League Park, which was much smaller, but it was owned by the Indians, and therefore they didn't have to pay rent to anybody, as opposed to Cleveland, who wanted the Indians to pay every time they used the stadium.
Not only was League Park much smaller, but Municipal Stadium wasn't even comparable to some of the other stadiums like New York, and some of the wooden structures were certainly so much smaller to maintain than Municipal Stadium.
Well, Municipal Stadium, when it could easily fit over 70,000 people. Otherwise, the parks in that era were more like 20,000 seat parks, 30,000 seat parks, and so this was just a cavernous place and the players didn't particularly like, when they did play baseball games there, they didn't particularly like it because it was a lot harder to get home runs hit. At this time, it was just and wasn't the warm, friendly confines of League Park, and so the players didn't particularly like playing in Cleveland Stadium anyway.
When did Bob Feller make his debut for the Cleveland Indians?
Well, it was during the 1930s. It was in July 1936 where a 17-year-old Bob Feller made his appearance. He had been signed the previous winter, and he made his debut as a relief pitcher on July 19th, 1930. I think I said 37, but it's 36. 1936, as a 17-year-old, and so he ended up pitching some additional games there. But the thing is, he was in high school. He was a high school junior going into his senior year, and here he is playing professional baseball for the Cleveland Indians.
Just unbelievable talent. He was a farm boy in Van Meter, Iowa, I believe, and he worked a lot on the farm and had really muscular build, and constantly would throw the ball up against the barn, lore has it. Is that correct?
That's the way he would get his arms strong, and that although early in his career he had arm problems, and it turned out that his career was nearly derailed because of his arm problems, but it turned out that he had dislocated his throwing arm, and a doctor recognized this and relocated the bone in his arm, and that saved his career.
How did the Cleveland Indians perform in the decade of the 1940s? Well,
the 1940s were a good era for the Indians. It started off great because they started off with a opening day no-hitter in 1940 with Bob Feller pitching that, and still to this day the only opening day no-hitter in Major League Baseball history. And so that against the Chicago White Sox in Old Comiskey Park. It was a very cold day. The Indians only won 1-0, but Bob Feller persevered, and they had no hits that day, and he always was very proud of that. He was always proud of the fact that he had the only opening day no-hitter.
I think we also have an autographed baseball that my daughter stood in line for quite some time and got that. And I think you have several Bob Feller signature baseballs too, Carl, and he really signed a lot of things for people.
Bob Feller was very open and very accessible to the public. That's one of the things that everybody always liked about him. Never passed up signing something. He always liked to talk baseball. He had a phenomenal memory about, he could tell you how of a particular count on a player when he got a hit. I mean, what a baseball mind he had.
And he was a real patriot. He was, once Pearl Harbor happened, he signed up immediately after that and lost 4 of his prime years on the mound. What would his record have been had he been on the mound? Well,
we know he won 266 games, but had he been able to play during those years of 42, 43, 44, and the first half of 45, he could have easily been over a 300-game winner. But he always said, only one win that counted, and that was the win of the war. And so he never regretted making that decision.
Yeah, very, very patriot down to his core. What about Bill Veeck, a very colorful owner of the Cleveland Indians? When did he go ahead and purchase the tribe?
He ended up purchasing the Cleveland Indians at the end of the 1946 season. And for that reason, Bill Veeck was a big showman. You can kind of see in this picture, a gregarious guy. He was just a real, I'm sure, a very fun guy to be around. But he was being a big promoter, he wanted big crowds. And he knew he was not going to get the big crowds at Old League Park. And so for that reason, kind of unceremoniously, the last game of the Indians played was in September of 1946. And then after Bill Veeck purchased the team, he announced that they would not be playing any more games at League Park and started to play all of the games at Municipal Stadium where he could attract those big crowds. And they got some big crowds and some big gate attendance, which is what he wanted during the 47, 48, 49 seasons that he owned the team.
Some of the things that he brought forth, he had roving bands. He had a midget that he brought up to bat, 3'7". He went ahead, had Ladies' Day, and tried to get more women in the park. He was quite an innovator. And when home runs, the scoreboard and the bombs going after the Indians hit a home run.
And he continued that. Even he eventually owned the White Sox, and he did the same thing there at Comiskey Park. But he was a very fearless innovator and also promoter. He was real big on wanting people to come out and see the games, and the attendance really spiked during the Bill Veeck years.
Who did the Indians play in the 1948 World Series?
Well, 1948 was one of those miracle seasons when everybody on the team seemed to have their career years, and so when that happens, they just start winning and just things all click and all work together. So in 1948. The team won the pennant barely because they had to beat the Chicago or the Boston Red Sox in a one-game playoff. And in Fenway in order to win the pennant, but then they faced the other Boston team, the Boston Braves. And so in 1948, you had both Indians teams playing each other in the World Series. You had the Cleveland Indians and the Boston Braves playing each other in the World Series.
And again, that, as you indicated before, crowds, staying there overnight almost to get tickets and get in, and it really established all sorts of records for the number of people that saw that World Series.
Well, the biggest game that, in terms of attendance, was in the Game 5 when it looked like the Indians were going to be able to win at home against the Braves. 86,000 plus showed up at Cleveland Stadium. I can only imagine how stuffed this place had to be with all those people in there. But Bob Feller was on the mound. It looked like they were going to be able to wrap it up there at home. Unfortunately, Bob Feller didn't have his A game that day, and Boston would win that game, but then they'd go back to Boston and win in Game 6 at Boston.
So really, Bill Veeck was proven right that you build it, you build a stadium, and people will come if the product, and I remember listening growing up to Pete Franklin, and he says if the Indians ever had a very competitive team, the people would come out of the woodworks. They were right.
No, that was one thing that the people knew, that they referred to the Indians like the sleeping giant, because they would, out of nowhere, they get these surge crowds that would come to the stadium and have 70,000. That would be very common. The opening day would be 70,000 people would show up for the opening day, and that's 10% of the whole attendance for the whole year. But Northeast Ohio will support a Cleveland baseball team if they're a good team.
There's no question about it. What about how competitive were the Cleveland Indians in the 1950s?
Well, 1950s, I always like to think that was the golden era of the Cleveland Indians baseball, because during that decade, they had no losing seasons. You
mean out of 10 seasons?
They were 10-0.
They didn't have one losing season?
No losing
Wow.
seasons in the 1950s. Yeah. They had the 1954 season, which we'll talk about a little bit, and when they won the pennant, but otherwise they were in second place 6 other times. They had a .587 winning percentage during the 1950s, and so they always were effectively the second place team to you-know-who, the New York Yankees. The Yankees were always there, it seemed.
It seemed like once they hired Casey Stengel, 1949, they won 5 consecutive World Series titles. So the Yankees, and they would go out and spend money and find, fill holes that they had. They had very fine pitching, and they had relief pitchers. They were just a little bit better, and they were pretty lucky that they didn't have a lot of injuries during some of those seasons.
And what they would also do is they would find good players that were signed by other teams, and they would get those players. And so if they didn't buy them, they would find a way to trade for them, so they would end up using the other teams as their farm teams. And then they did that with the Kansas City Athletics. That's what they were very good at, but pulling teams and players off of them, and also Cleveland Indians. They got players off of the Cleveland Indians to help support the Yankees' efforts too.
But 1954, we did make it. We were on top, and I think was a record-setting year for wins in the American League. Is that correct?
In 1954, the Cleveland Indians won 111 games, 111 of 43. They beat the New York Yankees out by 8 games, and so they looked like these guys were going to be unbeatable in 1954. They were so good, and they would face the New York Giants in the World Series. But I mean, after winning 111 games, this was just a matter of how many games would it take for the Indians to win the World Series in '54, and would it be a sweep? And it turned out it was a sweep for the Giants, who swept them in 4 games. And that's the crazy thing about baseball, because there's no reason why the Cleveland Indians of 1954 should have lost that series, let alone get swept by the Giants, who were a good team. They won 97 games, but not like that, not swept. They just got cold at the wrong time.
The manager of the Indians, who managed the club during that time?
Al Lopez was the manager this time. He was a former catcher who played with the Indians at one time too. A great manager. He ended up going to the White Sox and managed the White Sox in the 1959 World Series. So very well-respected manager. You can tell he did a great job because of the fact that they won so much during the 1950s. But you know, I'm sure he just felt helpless during this whole time, thinking he just can't make them win, and just a fluky thing. Of course, the thing that set the whole thing off was in 1954 Game 1 with Willie Mays making that over-the-shoulder catch off of the bat of Vic Wirtz.
I think we have a picture of it right here. That was phenomenal, and Willie Mays commented that was certainly one of his highlights of his career.
Yeah, and, I mean, it was an over-the-shoulder catch, and when you watch the film of it, you actually is slowing up because he outran it so much. Now, that ball went an estimated 460 feet off the bat of Bill Veeck. It was his own,
Vic Wirtz.
Vic Wirtz, I said the wrong thing. Vic Wirtz, and it was his only out of the day. It would have been a home run in any other park except for the Polo Grounds, which you couldn't, I don't know how you could ever hit it. You'd have to hit it 500 feet to hit it out of there. But he ran it down, and that set the whole tone for the game, and they would end up just losing. It's one of those things that just unexplainable.
It took the wind out of the Indian sails, and they just never recovered from that. Although, you know, we have to comment, Carl, that Cleveland's pitching was overwhelming. On that staff, I think, was Bob Lemon, Mike Garcia. Bob Feller was kind of in the twilight of his career, but it was a formidable staff.
They had 4 very good starting pitchers during that time, which again, you think any of those guys should be able to put together a very strong performance and get them through.
I think Early Wynn, I think 2 Hall of Famers at least on that.
Early Wynn was on that team too, but that's baseball. Again, things that just don't make any sense, which is what makes the game such a great thing to watch, because things happen that should never happen, one way or the other.
What about going through the rest of the 1950s? What about the second half? You said during that decade we were 10-0 per season, so it really didn't go down too much from there.
The next year, in 1955, the team had a good season again. I think I finished 2 back, but just, you know, again, a very good team, but just not quite good enough to beat the Yankees in 1955. That was the first year for Herb Score, who didn't make his appearance in 1955. He was the Rookie of the Year in 1955, and it looked like once again that Cleveland's dominant pitching would continue on. Herb Score would have a very good 1956, a 20-game winner in 1956, and so things were looking up for him until 1957, early in the season, when he got hit in the eye by the line drive by Gil McDougall of the Yankees. And Herb Score always said that did not stop him. He said he got a lot of injuries afterward, and that's what stopped his career, because after that he was a sub-500 pitcher after that injury. But I suspect that what happened is that because of the injury, maybe he changed his mechanics, maybe he was a little more concerned about getting hit again, and so because of that, again, it's all speculation. That's what baseball is. It's, you know, just talk about baseball things, but he admitted he was never the same after that. He ended up being traded.
Unlike Carl Mays, who beamed Ray Chapman, Gil McDougall was really distraught.
Yes, he was.
When he hit Herb Score with the line drive, and I think visited him in the hospital and was very remorseful. Is that true?
That is true. He was very remorseful for that, and very sorry he hit him, but you know, obviously he didn't mean to do it. But it just, Herb Score, just the way he pitched, he left himself wide open for that line drive right back, and he couldn't have caught the ball because of the way his delivery was. And again, that's maybe what happened to him. He might have changed his delivery to prevent that from happening in the future.
Seems like the Indians had some bad luck along the way. They were good, but not quite good enough to get to the. And then, of course, during this era, there wasn't divisional play. In other words, if you didn't win the American League, then you advanced automatically to the World Series. Now we have so many levels, like last year. The Guardians got to the playoffs, and they then could advance.
I often think if they would have had some additional layers of playoffs during the 1950s, Indians would have been able to maybe continue on and get some extra World Series appearances, but that wasn't the case.
Right. We talked about several of the players during the 1950s. What about one of my heroes and favorites, Rocky Colavito? Rocky
Colavito was a fan favorite, and one of the things about the Indians during the 50s, if you look at the attendance numbers were always sliding down, and even though the Indians were a good team, they didn't have any stars. And so when Rocky Colavito was signed by the Indians, in fact, he was actually courted by the Yankees, but he didn't like the way the Yankees treated him, so he ended up signing with the Indians. That he was the star that the Cleveland Indians needed. He was very personable, he was polite, friendly, very fan approachable, and of course, great looks, the great star looks, but of course the home run hitter. And so that brought the fans out. Then they finally had a star that they could believe in and send around. He had all these different product endorsements, and so he was really the toast of the town for the Indians in the late 1950s.
And he, again, had a very good arm in right field. People really enjoyed him. The only comparison that I've heard of, the ability from Roberto Clemente, had a very accurate arm, but Rocky Colavito could throw that ball right to the plate, and he was very accurate in the outfield.
He had a rocket arm. One of the things he did was he always get a rubber ball, and he'd always be squeezing the rubber ball to get his arms strengthened. And so he would routinely from right field throw it sometimes over the catcher. He would throw it with such speed, and also at third base. He would just, if he's throwing to third base, sometimes way over the third baseman's head, because he would throw it so hard. So he had a phenomenal throwing. In fact, he did pitch in 1958. He did make a relief appearance for the Indians in 1958 as a pitcher.
Well, Carl, I enjoyed it very much today. We covered a lot of ground, but we have one more show to go, and we'll take it up from almost 1960 to the present, and some woeful teams in that decade. But the 1990s turned things around, and we'll get to that next time. And thank you for viewing Bruce on the Loose, and we will see you in an upcoming show.
You are watching WCTV, Wadsworth Community Television.